here's your news for February 29th, 2020. We are kicking off this leap year video with news from SmackDown, as after winning the Universal title in Saudi Arabia, Goldberg became the first person to win a major WWE championship after becoming a Hall of Famer. Though some have wrestled after being inducted, Goldberg is the first to hold a top singles title, though the wrestling world is still processing the fact that the Hall of Famer was able to end Wyatt's reign with the gold at Super Showdown. It doesn't help matters that the match was far from great, as Goldberg was just able to lift Wyatt up for a poor incarnation of the jackhammer before slamming him down to capture his second reign as champion. Actor and wrestling fan Macaulay Culkin quickly reacted on social media, claiming that he'd canceled his tickets to Tampa, where WrestleMania 36 will be, after what happened, and now Goldberg has responded to the Home Alone star. Never one to shy from letting fans know what he thinks, Goldberg responded to Culkin's tweet with "Duly noted, dork," as it doesn't look like the new champion cares all that much regarding the pushback he's receiving. Responding to Goldberg, Culkin told the two-time Universal Champion, "Just don't try to tombstone me," referencing Goldberg's botch-filled encounter against The Undertaker at Super Showdown 2019, and Wyatt himself has also commented on Twitter. Claiming that life is a circle when he landed back in Boston from Saudi Arabia, the Fiend also said that no matter how bright you try to make your life, the darkness is always bound to come again. Many speculated that this tweet was Wyatt setting his sights on John Cena instead of the Universal title, and by the end of SmackDown, this match was made official for WrestleMania 36. Hopefully Wyatt can defeat the 16-time world champion at the biggest show of the year, as his career needs a big win right now following his loss to Goldberg. We've got more news from the Goldberg-Wyatt match, as one person who knows all about The Fiend is Seth Rollins. After all, the Architect lost the Universal title to The Fiend at Crown Jewel 2019, and while fans aren't happy with The Fiend losing the title to Goldberg, Rollins was watching closely. As one half of the Raw Tag Team Champions, Rollins took to Twitter after the Super Showdown main event, saying he should have pulled out the jackhammer, as that was the move that finally put down The Fiend. During their Crown Jewel match, Wyatt was able to overcome many curb stomps, and while the former Universal Champion was also able to kick out after 4 spears, it seems the jackhammer is Bray's kryptonite. Perhaps Seth will need that information if they ever cross paths again, but it's hardly surprising that the Monday Night Messiah is feeling smug seeing his old adversary lose, especially as he and Murphy retain their tag titles at Super Showdown. Rollins is just one of many current stars who have commented on the match, as multiple NXT superstars have poked fun at Goldberg. We previously reported that Matt Riddle sarcastically commented that Goldberg used the bro hammer instead of the jackhammer, and now Riddle's tag partner Pete Dunne has also weighed in, claiming that the new Universal Champion is a big Broserweights fan. This comment was echoed by Velveteen Dream, who also claimed that Goldberg had used the bro hammer, while Tyler Breeze claimed that the new champion may have suffered a hernia after the match. Despite these comments, we doubt that Goldberg cares what other people think, as he was able to leave Saudi Arabia as Universal Champion exactly as he planned. Of course, WWE Super Showdown is just one show in the WWE's 10-year deal with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and the company will be back again later this year. According to Wrestling Club, a WWE employee confirmed to them that the WWE will be back in October, as they said in a translated tweet. Exclusively, a WWE worker yesterday assured us that the next wrestling show in Saudi Arabia will be in October, but the city has not yet been identified. It'll be interesting to see who WWE can get for their next event, as they've historically brought huge shows to Saudi Arabia, but what we know for now is that they have 8 months to plan ahead. We're looking at Friday Night SmackDown now, as the show opened with Goldberg coming out to ask who's next, which led to Roman Reigns appearing and telling the Universal Champion, "I'm next." By the end of the broadcast, the match was made official, as Roman Reigns will face Goldberg for the Universal title at WrestleMania 36. This will be Roman's first singles opportunity at the Gold since his return from leukemia last year, and the big dog is hoping to get the biggest win of his career in his home state on April 5th. From one Hall of Famer to another now, as Booker T has spoken about a lot on his podcast and recently commented on the Goldberg-Reigns match. On his Hall of Fame podcast, the 5-time WCW World Champion said he was a fan of the booking direction, as it'll be a battle to see who has the best spear. He said, "I like it. Old spear versus young spear. If they can mix in a little Shakespeare, everything will be beautiful. I like it because my thing is, how else were we going to get the belt off the Fiend? Who was going to take it off of him? Who else can we believe for a moment? We may not even believe this, but who else taking the title off the Fiend would have been better than Goldberg? What's better, Roman conquering the Fiend or Roman conquering Goldberg? Booker will be a happy camper now that the Reigns-Goldberg match has been made official, as fans will get to see who has the better spear between the two on April 5th at WrestleMania 36. Now, we've already commented on what stars like Booker T, Macaulay Culkin, and Seth Rollins have had to say about Goldberg's victory at Super Showdown, but there's plenty of other names who have given their 2 cents. Following Goldberg's victory at Super Showdown, Scott Hall took to Twitter to comment on the new Universal Champion, saying that it's time to dust off his taser. Older fans may remember that it was Hall who helped break Goldberg's incredible winning streak in WCW thanks to a taser, and it looks like the bad guy is ready to let Roman Reigns borrow it if he needs to. From one Hall of Famer's return that fans haven't liked to one that they loved, as this year also saw the in-ring return of Edge, though the Rated R Superstar's happiness was short-lived. Just one day after returning at the Royal Rumble, Edge was brutally attacked by Randy Orton, and while the former world champion has yet to make a return to the ring, his wife Beth Phoenix is expected to give an update on his condition on Raw. According to the Wrestling Observer newsletter, the plan remains for Edge and Orton to face off at WrestleMania 36, but there will be, quote, stipulations to be named later. They said, "It's unclear what WWE plans on adding to this match. The idea of Edge versus Randy Orton is enough to get fans interested. They might add a gimmick like No Holds Barred or otherwise to really make the importance of the contest stand out during the show of shows." Edge is reportedly contracted to wrestle a reported 9 matches over the next 3 years, and he's already had 1 match and 1 appearance on WWE TV already. With that in mind, the WWE needs to use Edge sparingly, so they're going to make his WrestleMania return count against the Viper. At the 2020 Royal Rumble pay-per-view, Beth Phoenix made her return to the ring as well, long before her husband Edge, and according to the latest reports, both members of the Hall of Fame couple will be competing at the show of shows. The Glamazon is slated to be on Raw this week to provide an update on Edge's condition, but she could also be starting her own road to WrestleMania, as the Wrestling Observer newsletter noted that Beth and Natalya are currently slated to team up again at WrestleMania, and this time could be leaving as champions. It's reported that the plan is for the Divas of Doom to take on the WWE Women's Tag Team Champions, the Kabuki Warriors, for the titles at WrestleMania, though the report also said that WWE should wait before making the match official. It reads, "One would think this match can't be announced until 3/9 or later, since both Asuka and Natalya are in the Women's Elimination Chamber match. The two were paired off with each other during the contract signing angle for the Chamber." As the longest reigning women's tag team champions, Asuka and Kairi Sane haven't had any real opponents to defend the titles against, though that appears to be changing very soon. We'll just have to wait and see who walks out of Tampa with the tag titles, as this year will be the second year that the women's tag gold will be defended at the biggest show of the year. On to some Undertaker news now, as the WWE Universe never knows where the dead man will appear, and given that many fans weren't expecting to see him at Super Showdown, they certainly didn't think he'd be appearing on Twitch. During the Twitch livestream of Dr. Disrespect, where he was playing Overwatch, the Phenom appeared after Disrespect walked in front of a green screen and said, "I have no patience for the 2-time. WWE is my domain, my yard. Your transgressions will be punished. Dr. Disrespect, you will rest in peace." After The Undertaker left, Dr. Disrespect got back to playing Overwatch, and this isn't the first time the popular streamer has worked with WWE. Both the Twitch streamer and the WWE posted footage of Disrespect's encounter with the dead man, and it just goes to show that you'll never know when the demon of Death Valley will strike. We are going back in time to last year, as Kevin Owens didn't get KO Mania in 2019, as Kofi Mania took over and Vince McMahon had to change his plans so that Kingston could win the WWE title. This year, though, it appears Owens is on track to get a match at the show of shows, as the Wrestling Observer noted that there is a plan for Owens and Seth Rollins to face one more time on the grandest stage of them all. While the current plan is for a singles match between the two, the fact that Rollins holds the Raw Tag Team titles with Murphy may change things, as the report reads, One match will involve Seth Rollins, it could be a singles match with Kevin Owens, and as of 10 days ago, that was the plan. It could be Rollins and Murphy defending the tag titles with Owens and a partner. Samoa Joe's wellness suspension will expire on March 24th, meaning there is time for him to be added to the match if the company chooses to make this a Raw Tag Team title affair. Whatever the case, this is certainly an interesting situation, as the Monday Night Messiah seems to factor into Owens' WrestleMania plans with or without a partner. As a former Universal, NXT, United States, and Intercontinental Champion, Owens has been a huge star in WWE, and has had quite a few pieces of merchandise on WWEshop.com, though his latest shirt might be his most special yet. In a video, the prizefighter commented on his new "Just Keep Fighting" shirt, and revealed that the idea for the shirt came from when a fan contacted him on Twitter and told him just how much those words meant to him when they were going through their own personal struggles. Now, Owens is going even further, as he revealed in a video. With that in mind, I've decided, after speaking to my wife, that all the profits I make from this shirt are going to two organizations that help with mental health, one in Canada and one in the US. The former Universal Champion will be donating the profits to the Canadian Mental Health Association and the National Alliance for Mental Illness. While this is something Owens doesn't have to do, the Canadian was clearly moved by the comments he received on Twitter. And while the Raw superstar said that it may be a little while before he knows just how much is donated, due to the way WWE royalties work, he'll keep everyone up to date on this amazing gesture. From Raw to SmackDown now, as during this week's show, it was revealed that Jeff Hardy will be on WWE Backstage this week. After suffering a knee injury in April last year, Jeff has spent the past 10 months recovering, and though he should be all healed up, some personal issues stemming from a DUI arrest have gotten in the way. Hardy was backstage at SmackDown last week, and given his upcoming appearance on FS1's WWE Backstage, this is a very good sign that the charismatic enigma will be back in the ring very soon. We're heading overseas now, as the WWE is always trying to capture as much TV distribution as possible, and India is a huge market that they really want to get in on. This week, the Wrestling Observer newsletter claimed that WWE's television deal with India is either finalized or close to, and this is a huge deal for WWE, as it was asked about a couple of times during the company's 2019 fourth quarter investors call. WWE's contract with India expired last year, and there were hopes that something would be in line by the time 2020 rolled around, and though it didn't happen in time, there is an expectation that they've finally accomplished it. Though the company's last deal in India was reportedly for $34 million, this new deal is estimated at $125 million a year, a huge increase that would make the Asian nation the number 2 market for WWE's TV deals behind the US. From India to the UK now, as British boxer Tyson Fury defeated Deontay Wilder in a big way recently, and now the path is clear for the Gypsy King to return to WWE. The Wrestling Observer noted that there have been talks of Fury appearing at WrestleMania, but nothing could be discussed at this time. The reason why talks have stalled may be down to money, as after defeating Wilder, the Gypsy King's price went up, and he might be asking for more money than WWE is willing to give, as he could bring a lot of publicity to the show. The report reads, "The big question is money. Fury, with the win, is in a much higher income bracket than a few months ago. In no way would Fury be worth millions for one show given what he would mean as far as WWE Network subscribers. And no way he's working for less than millions." The same report also said that WWE is running out of opponents if Fury competed in a match, as they said, "Given that every significant star is figured in, the only names I could see as an opponent if a deal is made would either be Big Show with the size gimmick and he can lose with no issue, or Triple H, who one would think would also have to lose." Given the falling ratings recently, WWE needs something big to entice a streaming service to purchase the rights to WrestleMania. And while putting the Universal title on Goldberg probably helped, having a big name like Fury on the grandest stage of them all would almost certainly seal the deal. One name that many fans want to see at WrestleMania is CM Punk, but in a recent interview, the Second City Savior had his eyes set elsewhere. In the interview, Punk teased wrestling for AEW while maintaining under contract for Fox, as it looks like the wrestler turned MMA star turned actor doesn't have any regrets about walking away from McMahon's company in 2014. In Lars Sullivan news, the Wrestling Observer noted that the Freak should be ready for a return fairly soon, but his name hasn't been brought up backstage in WWE recently. WWE doesn't want to release Sullivan or anyone, or risk them going to AEW, but given that the company isn't focused on him much right now, it'll be interesting to see how his career pans out when he comes back. On SmackDown this week, fans got a new Elimination Chamber match added to next Sunday's show, featuring the new SmackDown Tag Team Champions, John Morrison and The Miz. At the show, the duo will defend against The New Day, Lucha House Party, The Usos, Heavy Machinery, and Rude and Ziggler in what will no doubt be a physical match. And finally, as you may have seen on SmackDown, Sasha Banks returned this week, and there could be big plans for her at WrestleMania. There's been speculation that the Boss will face Trish Stratus at WrestleMania, and though the Canadian is considered retired, Stratus has teased coming out for one more match. Hopefully fans will get more answers as we carry on the road to WrestleMania, which could be very interesting for the Boss.